Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a really deep dive into the architecture of modern power itself.
We are, and we're being guided by the collected insights of one of the most persistent system critics of the last century. We're looking at how institutional power structures, from government all the way to corporate media, how they actively define and constrain the acceptable limits of thought.
And not just thought, but action, too. And they do this within societies that, ostensibly call themselves democracies.
Right, and that's the core tension.
It is. I think the central, deeply provocative question this deep dive forces you to confront is this. How?
How does it happen?
How is public opinion so often just effectively marginalized? And how do elites manage to keep policy going in a direction that serves vested interests, financial and corporate interests?
Even when a huge portion of the public is saying, no, we don't want this.
Exactly. It's a fundamental paradox of modern life.
It really is. You vote, you participate, but so often the direction of the ship just seems completely unmoved by what people actually want.
And understanding the mechanics of that system control is just so vital right now.
Especially now. I mean, we're in an era of massive global economic restructuring, intense social stratification, and maybe most critically, this just overwhelming information overload.
Yeah, that overload often obscures what's really going on underneath, the incentive structures.
That's a great point. We feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of news, but the source material we're using today suggests the volume isn't the problem.
The filtering mechanism is the problem. And a really crucial clarification before we dive in.
Okay.
This is a systems-level analysis. Our mission here is to look at the mechanisms and the incentives that produce these very specific, predictable outcomes.
In governance, in culture, across the board.
Right. We're focused purely on the why and the how of how the system operates, the rules of the game. We're not getting into partisan debate or, trying to assign individual blame to specific people.
We're looking at the design of the machine, not trying to judge the moral character of the mechanic who just happens to be standing in front of it today.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that systemic focus is what lets us gain real insight into how power actually works, no matter who's in office.
So let's talk about the source material for this deep dive.
Our guide today is the book Understanding Power, The Indispensable Chomsky, edited by Peter R. Mitchell and John Shuffle. It was published back in 2002.
And what makes this particular book so unique is its structure. I mean, it's not some dense, scholarly monograph that's almost impossible to get through.
Not at all. It's actually compiled from transcriptions of dozens of question and answer sessions.
Real live events, teach-ins that Chomsky held over a period of years.
Exactly. The editors took these spontaneous dialogues, cleaned them up for readability, and then meticulously reorganized everything by topic.
The result is a text that feels incredibly conversational. It has the rigor and the evidence of his academic work, but it's delivered in this interview-style format.
It really does. It feels like you're sitting right there in the room with him, asking the hard questions. It just lowers the barrier to entry for anyone trying to understand these complex ideas.
So we are, of course, talking about Noam Chomsky. He's known globally for his foundational work in linguistics, but just as much for his sharp, decades-long political analysis. What really defines his approach to political critique?
Well, his approach is rooted in a pretty fundamental ethical principle. His critique is almost always focused on the actions of his own powerful state, the United States.
And he's very clear about why he does that.
He is. He explains it's not out of some simple anti-Americanism. It's a recognition that those are the actions he's responsible for as a citizen.
And those are the actions he can realistically hope to affect change upon.
Right. He argues that if you spend your time criticizing atrocities committed by enemy states while you're ignoring or excusing the ones committed by your own, you're essentially just functioning as a propagandist for your own system.
So the ethical and political responsibility really lies in criticizing your own power structure first.
That's the core of it.
That reframes the whole mission of critique, doesn't it? It's not about global moral judgment. It's about accountability, starting right here at home.
And the discussions in this book, they mostly cover analysis from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s, but they use a very wide lens of history to identify these insistent patterns of behavior.
That historical period, the end of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath, was such a crucial time for seeing how these mechanisms of power adapt.
It really was. And the book uses key historical touch points to illustrate these patterns. Things like the domestic dissidents that limited the Reagan administration's goals in Central America.
Or going further back, the U.S. role in the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62.
And then the media coverage of more recent events from that period, like the Gulf War in 1991, and of course the Iran-Contra hearings.
These events aren't just historical footnotes in the book. They're treated almost like controlled experiments. Case studies in how systemic power operates and how information gets filtered when that power is challenged.
Yes. And if we had to distill the entire book down to a single analytical statement, a central thesis,
What would it be?
it's that in the contemporary era, true systemic power doesn't primarily reside in the political state, Congress, the president. It's in the private economy.
So the giant transnational corporations, the big financial institutions, the business organizations that really dictate investment and production.
That's where the real power is.
So if the locus of power is economic and private, then the function of the political government has to change, right?
Exactly. The role of the state becomes largely managerial. Its primary function is to preserve the control of what Chomsky calls the minority of the opulent.
The wealthy, interconnected corporate class.
Right. And the state does this in two main ways. First, by marginalizing any meaningful public participation in big decisions, and second, by producing this carefully filtered information environment.
A system of indoctrination, basically, to keep the public pacified, isolated, and focused on other things.
That's the framework.
Okay, so let's unpack that first method, marginalizing the public, by diving into the impact of resistance. Our first core idea is power and domestic dissidence, the margin for survival.
This point really tackles that cynical question you always hear. Does activism or protest actually matter?
And Chomsky's answer is pretty nuanced.
It's very nuanced. He acknowledges that, no, activism hasn't fundamentally changed the structure of the institutions. Corporations still dominate the economy. The state still manages their interests. But it has dramatically changed the culture. And critically, it has limited the permissible scope of state violence, especially abroad.
The historical contrast he draws between the 60s and the 80s is an incredible way to demonstrate this.
It's so stark. In the early 1960s, John F. Kennedy could openly send the American Air Force to bomb, napalm, and defoliate South Vietnam.
And launch huge terrorist operations against Cuba, all with pretty minimal domestic blowback. The public was either quiet or supportive.
Now, fast forward 2 decades to the Reagan administration, when his team tried to move toward direct military intervention in Central America in the early 80s.
In Nicaragua or El Salvador?
They were immediately forced to retreat from a direct, open war. Why? Because the domestic population had learned something profound from the Vietnam experience.
And that learning showed up as what the source calls a convulsion in the country.
It was a massive, decentralized mobilization. Church groups, student organizations, grassroots movements, all mobilizing to physically block aid, stage protests, and put immense political pressure on Congress.
So this public resistance meant the state couldn't just use overt, overwhelming force.
Right. Instead, they had to fall back on clandestine operations, secret arms sales, illegal funding through mercenary states, training terrorist forces like the Nicaraguan Contras.
The whole Iran-Contra scandal.
The entire sordid affair was, in essence, a sophisticated criminal attempt by the executive branch to get around a politically aware and resistant public.
So the very fact that they had to resort to these illegal covert means is actually a measure of the public's success.
That's exactly it. It created what he calls the margin for survival for those targeted countries.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, Chomsky argues that the fate of countries like El Salvador or Nicaragua in the 80s, the fact that they were spared total indiscriminate destruction.
The B-52s, the 82nd Airborne.
All of it. That was directly proportional to the degree of American domestic dissidence. That resistance prevented the state from deploying its full power. It saved millions of lives and gave those countries a small chance for independence.
That really redefines what political winning means. It's often about limiting the scope of destruction, not just achieving some ideal policy goal.
It absolutely does.
And this need to hide the state's true actions, that leads us directly into our second core idea, government secrecy. It's not for security, it's for control.
Yeah, Chomsky notes that if you really analyze the huge government apparatus for secrecy and classification, its overwhelming purpose is not to keep secrets from foreign enemies.
Foreign intelligence services pretty much know what's going on anyway.
They do. The real purpose is simply to prevent the domestic population, the citizenry, from knowing what its own government is doing in its name.
It's about keeping the secrets from us. He points out that if you look at secret internal documents that get declassified, 30 or 50 years later,
There's virtually nothing in them that ever had a genuine security-related concern. It's almost always about hiding political embarrassment or the real motives behind a policy from the people footing the bill.
and this is a classic, deeply historical method of cloaking power.
The book draws a parallel all the way back to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. He described how the institution of royalty was invented. It was deliberately designed to create a cloak of mystery around power.
Making it look above the ordinary person, inaccessible.
Exactly. It's the original PR campaign. If you can convince people that the challenges are too complex, too technical, or that great external enemies are constantly threatening to destroy you,
The public will eagerly hand over its authority to the king or the president or the military.
that mystery and manufactured fear are continuously required. The secrecy system maintains this pretense of constant existential threat, the Soviet Union back then, any other designated threat now, to justify massive spending and unchallenged foreign policy actions.
Actions that might otherwise provoke democratic opposition.
Precisely.
So if the state has to hide its actions through secrecy, how does it get the public to accept the policies it does reveal? That brings us to how they define the language of the debate itself. Our third insight is this crucial analysis of the true meaning of loaded political language.
Yes, this is basically a decryption tool for foreign policy talk. It reveals the underlying economic drivers.
So the book breaks down several key ideological terms.
It does. Let's take the term democracy. When the U.S. supports a foreign government because it has democracy, what that really means, structurally, is that the population runs the country in a way that specifically serves American multinational corporations.
So if that same government, even if it's popularly elected, decides to serve its own people's welfare first, say, by nationalizing resources, it is, by definition, considered undemocratic in the eyes of U.S. policymakers.
It's a threat to stability, regardless of its electoral legitimacy.
And the labels for political figures are just as revealing.
A moderate politician is simply one who follows U.S. orders and keeps the system open to foreign investment. The example cited is chilling.
Suharto in Indonesia.
Yeah. He carried out a brutal military coup in 1965, slaughtered somewhere around 500,000 people, mostly landless peasants, in just a few months. And he was instantly hailed by the West, by the New York Times, as a new moderate leader.
Because he opened the country up to massive foreign investment and destroyed the popular resistance.
That tells you everything you need to know about the function of that word, the ideology, the level of slaughter. It's irrelevant. Obedience to the corporate agenda is the only metric that matters.
And the opposite label, radical, is just as functional.
It just means any figure or state that doesn't follow U.S. orders. And this has nothing to do with whether the state is communist or socialist or even fascist.
The source notes the U.S. opposition to right-wing nationalists, like Perón in Argentina.
Exactly. Independence is the consistent issue being opposed, the unwillingness to subordinate your national priorities to the needs of foreign investors.
So that structural opposition to independence, a nation paying attention to its own population, is the core enduring principle of interventionism. It was never really about resisting communism.
And this brings us to our fourth core idea, which is the media and the structure of propaganda. This builds directly on that idea of managing perception. If true power is economic, how do they manage the public mind?
Well, the source actually quotes the foundational manual of the early public relations industry, written by Edward Bernays in the 1920s. It was literally titled Propaganda.
And that manual states that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is a central feature of a democratic system. It's seen as the moral duty of the intelligent minorities, the elite, to do this for the good of society.
So as people gained more rights, more access to voting, control by force became less viable.
And the requirement for sophisticated indoctrination, what he calls the manufacturing of consent, increases.
But the key distinction for the U.S. system is that the state propaganda is implicit. It's not explicit, like it would be in a totalitarian society. It's not the government telling you what to think.
Precisely. It provides the framework for debate. Think about a foreign policy debate on Nicaragua in the 80s. The spectrum of admissible opinion ran from, say, should we use contraforces, to should we use some other more conventional military means to overthrow their government.
So the debate itself, which is just focused on tactics, ends up strengthening the underlying unquestioned assumption.
That the Nicaraguan government must be eliminated. The entire range of acceptable thought just serves to ingrain that fundamental assumption in people's minds as the only possible way to think.
And the truly radical idea that the U.S. should just leave Nicaragua alone is excluded from the framework entirely.
And that exclusion of meaningful choice brings us to our fifth core insight: the marginalization of the public in political life. If the central goal is to protect the interests of that opulent minority, you have to make sure the public remains politically ineffective.
And the political system, especially those remote, highly publicized elections for president or senators, they're often far removed from meaningful popular control.
Which is precisely why they're so heavily publicized and funded. It's the ultimate symbolic exercise.
Chomsky argues that if you really want to make a tangible difference, voting for local candidates, the school committee, local bond measures, is often where the real impact on your life is felt.
Because those institutions are closer to popular control, they're less insulated.
So the mechanism of marginalization is actually simple. The less difference an election makes to the actual direction of policy, big decisions about investment, production, resource allocation, the more successfully the public has been marginalized.
Yes. If your choice is between two candidates who are both making slightly different tactical judgments, but are ultimately serving the same broad corporate and financial community,
then the public's choice is highly symbolic, but substantively irrelevant to the core direction of the country.
the systemic similarity between the candidates ensures policy continuity no matter who's celebrating on election night.
Okay, let's move from the core principles to the specific institutional mechanisms that enforce all this. We can start with corporate media ownership and filtering mechanisms. This explains why the media functions as a propaganda system, even with many high-integrity journalists working within it.
It's all about structural incentives. Agenda-setting institutions like the major networks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they aren't small, public-minded businesses.
They're huge, profitable mega corporations, often linked to even bigger conglomerates that include banks, aerospace companies, you name it.
And their business model fundamentally isn't selling news to citizens. It's selling privileged elite audiences, the political, managerial, and corporate class, to other businesses, to advertisers.
So their core revenue stream comes from other businesses. Their structural incentive is therefore irrevocably tied to protecting the interests of the business community as a whole.
And this business model creates these interconnected filters. The first one is a reliance on filtering through sources. Reporters have to overwhelmingly rely on vested interests. Government officials, high-status think tanks, corporate executives.
Because those are the authoritative and self-verifying sources.
Right, and a journalist who tries to go outside those established sources to, quote, independent experts or activists or ordinary citizens will immediately find that the level of evidence required to get published is exponentially higher.
It's a structural asymmetry.
A huge one. For example, reporting an atrocity committed by a U.S. enemy might just require a government press release. But reporting torture carried out by an American military officer or a U.S. corporation will require videotapes, sworn affidavits, internal documents, years of investigation.
This asymmetry ensures that the institutional narrative is always the path of least resistance for a working journalist.
And then there's a concision constraint. This is especially relevant for TV news. The medium demands short, easily digestible sound bites.
The 30-second clip, the 2-minute news segment.
And Chomsky argues this system makes it nearly impossible to present critical, detailed analysis coherently, because critical analysis is, by its nature, complex. It requires context, evidence, history, and challenging assumptions that take time to explain.
So if you try to distill a critique of the military-industrial complex into 30 seconds, you just sound like a radical ideologue with no evidence.
But if you try to distill the establishment view, the Russians are dangerous, we need more defense spending, that requires almost no evidence and fits neatly into the pre-established framework. The concision constraint is a powerful, invisible filter that favors conventional ideas.
And the ultimate measurable result of all this is the exclusion of public opinion when it conflicts with what the elites have decided.
This isn't just theory. The source gives powerful examples from the 80s. Take the nuclear freeze movement. Surveys showed 75% of the American public supported it.
Yet it had virtually no support in the mainstream media or among political leaders. It was an idea outside the accepted debate.
Or the opposition to U.S. intervention in Central America. Most of the public consistently thought the U.S. should just leave Nicaragua alone. But if you analyze the opinion pages in major papers like the New York Times or Washington Post,
They were overwhelmingly hostile to the Sandinista government.
In a nearly year-long period of intense coverage, only 2 columns in the major papers even raised the possibility that the Sandinistas should be allowed to survive. That position, which reflected a huge segment of popular opinion, was structurally inexpressible in the mainstream.
This filtering is deeply intertwined with the underlying economic machinery, specifically what the source calls the permanent war economy, state capitalism via the Pentagon. This reveals the fundamental hypocrisy of the free market ideology.
Right. Chomsky argues that the successful U.S. economy, especially its high-tech sector, is far from a free market. In fact, anything approaching true free market capitalism has been understood since the Great Depression to be a disaster.
Successful modern economies need massive government intervention to stabilize them.
And in the U.S., the structure this massive state sector takes is primarily through the military system. The Pentagon budget, NASA, the Department of Energy, this whole apparatus acts as the indispensable subsidy mechanism for virtually all advanced technology.
We're talking about massive, sustained investment in research, development, and procurement.
In electronics, computers, aircraft. The state pays for the incredibly expensive R&D, absorbs all the risk, and then hands the perfected, profitable technology over to private corporations to sell.
The internet itself, GPS technology, jet engines, all came directly from this system. It's corporate welfare on an enormous scale.
It is, and this is where the security cover becomes essential. The state can't call this corporate welfare because the public would demand accountability. They might want to spend that money on healthcare or education instead.
So as the first Secretary of the Air Force once said, the word to use is not subsidy. The word to use is security.
By framing it as security and maintaining the pretense of a constant existential threat, they ensure continuous, massive government financing of industry without any real public oversight.
And the system persists because the privileged, educated population depends on it. The source notes that when military spending briefly declined in 1986, it immediately resulted in falling real wages for college-educated skilled workers.
Engineers, managers, the very demographic that relies on the war economy for stable, high-paying jobs, this creates a powerful constituency for maintaining high spending under the guise of security, regardless of the actual threat level.
Next, let's map the process of elite consensus and marginalization of dissent through a fascinating historical contrast the book makes. Watergate versus COINTELPRO. This reveals what the system truly fears.
Right. Watergate, the break-in at the Democratic Party office, was treated as this severe, system-rocking scandal. It led to the resignation of a president. Why?
Because Nixon's people infringed on the prerogatives of other powerful people. It was an unacceptable intra-elite conflict.
Exactly. But at the exact same time, there were the vastly more significant COINTELPRO exposures. This was a massive, years-long FBI operation.
Including the assassination of a Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton.
Organizing race riots and 15 years of systematic disruption burglaries, planting false evidence against a legal political party, the Socialist Workers' Party.
The scale difference is just staggering. Watergate was petty burglary. COINTELPRO was a systematic national political police operation designed to destroy democratic rights.
Yet Watergate dominated the media and history books as the Great Scandal, while COINTELPRO was largely ignored by the mainstream.
What does that contrast prove?
It proves that system integrity, making sure powerful people and institutions are respected and not attacked from within, is prioritized over democratic rights. Infringing on the rights of the powerful is a huge scandal. Assaulting the rights of the marginalized is not.
This connects to the broader idea of the non-ideological class war that drives U.S. interventionism. The core principle isn't fighting communism.
No, it's consistently preventing independent development in the Third World, preventing a country from developing in a way that pays inadequate attention to the overriding needs of U.S. investors.
Therefore, that government, regardless of its ideology, has to be destabilized or overthrown.
This is why the U.S. will support allies, like Indonesia's military dictatorship, through genocide, or passively allow internal slaughter, like supporting Saddam Hussein as he crushed internal resistance after the Gulf War.
If it serves the regional order and protects investor priority. The principle isn't moral, it's purely structural and economic.
And the final piece of this map is the feedback loops between power, media, and policy. This explains how corporate power gets public legitimacy.
So corporate America is constantly organizing what amounts to a class war. Policies to crush unions, limit social spending, reduce taxes on capital.
But they need troops voters to maintain control of the state. And they can't openly campaign on a platform of, vote for me, I'm trying to crush your wages.
So they have to appeal to the public on other manufactured grounds.
Jingoism, racism, religious fundamentalism, fear of enemies. This manufactures a mass base of support among working-class voters for policies like tax cuts for the rich that ultimately crush their own interests. It's a mechanism of massive, systemically necessary misdirection.
And this behavior is dictated by the institutional structure, not by individual morality.
Right. A business has to maximize profit. An executive who fails to do so, even for moral reasons, is just replaced by someone who will. The institutional facts dictate the policy. The feedback loop is complete.
So that brings us to how this decades-old analysis translates to our modern, hyper-connected world. What are the present-day implications, starting with our modern media ecosystems?
Well, the core issue, Chomsky identified widespread public disillusionment, and the breakdown of civil society has only intensified. When people feel institutions are unresponsive, they desperately search for alternative explanations for their reality.
This often leads to what we could call a disillusionment vortex.
Yeah, that's a good term for it. This sense of helplessness and cynicism drives people to embrace elaborate conspiracy theories. Whether it's about deep state manipulations or specific historical events, they're looking for a hidden logic.
And crucially, this disaffected energy often gets channeled into activities that are guaranteed not to affect the structural reality of the world.
Chomsky was very critical of this on the academic left in the 90s, where energy was diverted into this intricate, unintelligible discourse of some crazed postmodernist variety, language that's too opaque to translate into effective organizing.
So if dissent becomes theoretical, inaccessible, or obsessively focused on tangential absurdities, it's rendered politically harmless.
And the institutions are quite happy to tolerate dissent that neutralizes itself.
What about foreign policy discourse and the savior narrative? Quick military actions like in Grenada or Panama often get really high public approval ratings. Why?
It goes back to concision and information control. The operations are quick, successful, and immediately forgotten because the narrative is driven by massive propaganda about some imminent threat. The public gets a quick win.
And we stand tall again.
Exactly. The approval is high not because of deep understanding, but because of simple jingoism and a manufactured victory. And crucially, the public never gets information about what happened afterward.
Like in Panama, where after the cameras left, there were massive roundups of union leaders and political opposition.
And that was barely reported in the U.S. media. The public perception is managed by controlling the beginning and the end of the story.
Moving to corporate power and inequality, the analysis highlights this two-tier welfare state.
Right. One reality for the rich, a powerful protectionist state, and another punitive reality for the poor, the supposedly brutal free market.
The system maintains the real welfare state for the rich. Bailouts, subsidies via the Pentagon, protection from market discipline.
Meanwhile, the state aggressively attacks the tiny component of welfare that goes to the poor, what Chomsky calls the pea on a mountain. And this isn't an accident, it's a weapon of class warfare.
The purpose of welfare reform is ideological.
It's to impose the value that human rights do not exist outside of what you can win on the labor market. If you can't sell your labor, you have no right to subsistence.
This reveals a deep institutionalized bias. Forcing poor mothers into low-wage labor is work. But the vital, complex task of raising children is not recognized as work.
Exactly. It reinforces market dependence. And for the resulting superfluous population, the urban poor who don't contribute to profit-making, the state manages them through massive crime control and imprisonment.
The statistics are staggering. The U.S. prison population more than tripled under Reagan and kept climbing, reaching the highest per capita rate in the Western world.
It's a mechanism to warehouse, control, and contain the population made useless by the economic system. It lets the more privileged population confine the resulting desperation and social collapse elsewhere.
And the ultimate consequence of all this is public disengagement and the collapse of civil society. We are atomized by design.
People are trained to be obedient and isolated, and that isolation is crucial because it makes you ineffective against indoctrination. You find out what you really think by interacting with others, by testing ideas and collective action.
And that isolation is maintained by institutional support for things that occupy thought and drain energy, like spectator sports.
Chomsky sees spectator sports as a successful mechanism for distraction. The irrational, intense loyalties you develop for a sports team can translate nicely to other areas, like nationalism and chauvinism. It occupies a space where political consciousness could otherwise grow.
This entire structure means we have to shift how we approach problems. The core analysis has to pivot away from individual morality and focus on systems versus individual blame.
When power systems act, their actions are usually rational within their own framework of maximizing profit and control. Chomsky calls this the pathology of the general society. If an individual pursues greed outside the system, robbing a store, we call them pathological.
But if they do the exact same thing within the acceptable corporate structure maximizing profit at the expense of human well-being or the environment, it's called normal, even though the outcome is vastly more destructive.
The system itself is ruthlessly designed to reward conformity and obedience. Honesty, independence, courage, those are not rewarded by concentrated power. Service and obedience are.
This leads to the mechanisms of manufactured consent and the intellectual class. The education system plays a specific role in this.
The institutional role of schools is largely to train people for obedience and conformity. This isn't necessarily through explicit political teaching, but through systemic selection and behavioral conditioning.
Those who deviate are weeded out or beaten back long before they reach positions of influence.
And elite universities are especially geared to taking young, potentially radical, intelligent people, sucking them into the dominant culture, and neutralizing them. They're taught to adopt categories of analysis that guarantee they'll never ask the right questions.
Like questioning the structure of corporate control itself.
Right. You can be a real radical as long as your discourse is functionally ineffective outside the academic bubble.
The next broader theme is power hidden behind neutrality, particularly the ideology of economics. The term free market itself is a powerful political weapon.
It's a weapon used against the general population to argue against social spending. And it's a weapon used against poor countries abroad, justifying robbing them by insisting they open their markets.
But in practice, no major transnational corporation succeeds without massive government intervention. The source cites a study showing every single one of the top 100 corporations had benefited substantially from state intervention. At least 20 had been saved from collapse by bailouts.
It highlights the profound hypocrisy. The ideology is deployed to disarm the population in poor nations, while the rich and powerful are always protected from market discipline by a very powerful state. The market is free for you, but not for me.
This whole analysis circles back to the gap between democratic ideals and practice.
The foundational struggle for democracy has been to continuously extend the domains of popular power, from just white male property owners to women to minorities to workers. The course of history shows real progress there. But the emergence of the modern industrial corporation represented a new, vast, powerful center of absolutist authority that now must be dismantled if true popular freedom is to be achieved.
Thomas Jefferson himself warned about this. He said, if power shifted to banking institutions and moneyed corporations, the democratic experiment would be over.
And the system that exists today, where corporate interests effectively control government and the population is fragmented, is a perfect reflection of James Madison's principle. The people who own the country ought to govern it.
Okay, let's step back and look at the whole picture. That's a powerful, systemic analysis, and it can feel pretty overwhelming. So what does this all mean for the learner today? How does this change our perspective?
Well, what the book really helps us see differently is that the power structure isn't fundamentally broken. It's performing exactly as designed by the minority of the opulent to protect their class interests.
So when you see a massive economic failure like mass unemployment existing alongside a vast amount of necessary work that needs to be done,
it's not a bug. It's a structural feature. The capitalist institution is simply incapable of putting those two things together because the profit motive overrides rational social planning.
and crucially, this analysis shows why ignorance is produced, not accidental. Indoctrination is comprehensive. It's embedded everywhere, from schooling to sitcoms to sports.
It creates specific blockages in how people are allowed to think about fundamental change. It makes alternative options subjectively unavailable. When people feel helpless or turn to extreme narratives, it's often because the system has actively prevented them from seeing constructive alternatives.
Which raises these profound questions about participation in change. Given the scale of modern problems, like the climate crisis, the analysis concludes that rational social planning is the only path that could possibly save people.
Yet the very concept of rational social planning is virtually subversive in a system dedicated to profit maximization.
But the book reminds us that the most effective, enduring form of social change has always come from the bottom up.
From a lot of people who nobody ever heard of doing work. That's the quiet, decentralized organizing that shifts the culture and limits the scope of state violence, just like the anti-war movement did.
And we are in a unique period marked by this tremendous disillusionment and disaffection from institutions, a condition that counterintuitively creates fertile ground where organizing for genuine social change ought to be very possible.
The challenge is to channel that disaffection away from the disillusionment vortex and towards tangible action.
That brings us to a final provocative thought.
That tremendous global economic failure, massive unemployment, alongside massive necessary work, is the catastrophic result of these institutional structures. And it raises a terrifying question.
Which is?
If the system structure fundamentally prevents solving massive, obvious human problems, and if the general population remains marginalized and distracted, is it possible that human beings will turn out to be a lethal mutation?
A species that destroys the conditions for its own survival because the structural profit motive overrides any ability to engage in rational planning for the future.
It's a dark thought, but one the analysis forces you to consider.
That is a profound thought to sit with, especially right now. This has been an in-depth exploration of the mechanisms detailed in understanding power, the indispensable Chomsky.
We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found these ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.